I invite all kinds of wildlife in. I had bird houses. In fact, I love this. So this year I had a caterpillar nest on a branch of one of my plums. And I did what Stefan up in Miracle Farm says, don't do anything. And 3 days later, it was pilfered with holes. The birds had eaten all the caterpillars they could reach. And then about a week or two later, I see half-inch long caterpillars crawling on the outside of the nest. A few days later, there were none, and there were holes in the nest again. Then I saw bigger caterpillars, the ones that I guess they didn't get, were crawling on top of the nest. And a few days later, the nest was completely decimated. There were no caterpillars and no nest. That's the way you want it to work, right? And, normally people see a nest, they destroy it. But my philosophy now is, no, the birds need something to eat. If they don't have something to eat, they're not going to be around.
I'm Neil Collins, and on the show today we have Dani Baker, a retired clinical psychologist and self-taught gardener. Dani has a healthy dose of enthusiasm, and she talks about finding land on an island where she bought a farm, the revelation she had moving towards permaculture principles rather than annual gardening, and how she makes her world spin as a business owner. Maybe it's just me, but I often daydream about retiring to a beautiful piece of land that I can steward and become a full-time farmer. You see, I secretly long for a life free from the constant need to check emails and phone calls, where my primary focus can be to work with Mother Nature and increase biodiversity, tend to plants and animals, and just do all the things. And I'm sure that I'm not alone. The challenge, though, is that I know that this is looking through rose-colored glasses at life. I know that the role of a farmer is far from just planting seeds in the ground and watching them grow. It requires an immense amount of education that comes through experiential learning. It requires financial acumen around cash flow and the seasonality of the business. A successful farmer must be competent when it comes to marketing and branding. They need to possess good managerial skills. And now, because of the economic times that we're finding ourselves in, the need to be entrepreneurial and able to create additional streams of income. That's why I had a really nice time speaking with Dani Baker, the author of the book, The Home-Scale Forest Garden: How to Plan, Plant, and Tend a Resilient Edible Landscape. You see, Dani was able to accomplish her dream of moving to an island and becoming a farmer after she retired. But when she did that, she found herself working from sunup to sundown in her vegetable garden. But everything changed for her when she learned about permaculture. And that's whenever she began to educate herself on ecology and the symbiotic relationships that plants, bugs, fungi, and people can have together. She became captivated by the concept of a perennial food forest that didn't require so much of her time and energy. And Dani is also a great example of an enterprising and creative person that wants to help educate and inspire others. She does this by creating special opportunities for people to visit her farm or to work on her farm and to host events. She does this through her writing that is, I find, quite accessible and approachable and actionable for those of us that are on the journey to create life-giving, abundant, and ecologically rich gardens and landscapes. Well, Dani, it is a pleasure to have you here, from one islander to another across the country. But I really want to start off with where you grew up. And Did you have any agriculture or farming in your background, or is this a later in life hobby?
No agriculture or farming, but I grew up in northern Westchester County, which is a county north of New York City, but when I was there in the 50s, it was very rural. It was like country. Now it's suburbia, but it was like country. And when I was about 5 or 6, my parents bought a newly built house that was built on what had been a cornfield on half an acre. And there was no landscaping whatsoever. And in the 50s, my father had had a heart attack. I was the oldest. Me and my two siblings were preschoolers. And in the 50s, they told men when they had a heart attack, take it easy for the rest of your life. So my father didn't do any physical work. And my mother was very petite. She was 5 foot tall. She didn't have a lot of upper body strength. And so I was the oldest and the strongest. I got the job of pitchforking over all the flower beds and the vegetable garden and digging the holes for all the trees and then taking care of them until I was about 13 when we moved again to a city. And that was the end of my youthful gardening experience. But not only did I do that, but they had just built this development on the edge of fields and woods, and there was a pond down the way. So I spent a lot of time wandering by myself among the trees and the fields and down by the pond. And I got myself a tree book, and I taught myself how to identify trees by walking around and kind of testing myself. And also in the summers, my family spent time in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York State, in the Adirondack Park. So I really fell in love with that landscape. There, I would wander among pine trees. We would find all these berry patches, like a little foraging. I spent most of my youth outdoors. And I just feel a kinship, especially with trees.
What set you up for your professional life, and what did that look like? Did you even think that you could be doing things that are outdoors and nature-based for a profession?
I was very naive as a young person. I didn't know what made me happy. So I was very unhappy in college, and I don't recall this myself, but my sister and my college roommate both independently remember me fantasizing about wanting to be a farmer when I was in college. But I was on an academic track, and my parents had not completed college. So I was the first generation to go to college, and they expected me to be a professional, not a manual laborer. So I couldn't really even talk about it. I couldn't pursue that in any way. So I ended up being a psychologist.
And what kind of psychology did you practice?
Clinical. So I had a variety of different roles. I ran a day treatment program for developmentally disabled adults for a few years. I did some college teaching. I did some outpatient treatment. I worked as a probation officer for a while. And I ended up working for the New York State prison system. So as a psychologist in, several prisons.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's what I did.
And was there any gardening hobbies while you were in your adult life, or was this?
Well, whenever I had a little plot of land to do something with, I had a little vegetable garden. But I was pretty busy, especially in my last years when I worked for the facility, because I worked kind of 2 jobs for them. So I worked like 48 hours a week. And then I had a lot of recreational pursuits. I was an avid kayaker, cross-country skier, and I started a little side nature photography business. So I was taking photos and printing them and blowing them up and having shows all over the North Country. And I did all that until we bought the land that became our farm.
Well, yeah, let's go there. You live on Lawrence Island.
Wellesley Island.
How did
right.
you? Wellesley, excuse me.
Wellesley, right, in the St. Lawrence River, right. It's in New York State. It's in New York.
Wellesley Island.
It's an American island. It's part of New York State, but on one shore of the island is literally a stone's throw from Canada. You can throw a stone into Canadian waters.
What called you to that land?
Well, first of all, I was thinking about retiring from my job as a psychologist, and I'm not good with idle time. I knew that I needed some structure to my life. I needed things to do. And I couldn't imagine doing aerobic exercise for 16 hours a day in my late 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. So I thought if I had some land, I could maybe do a little landscaping. I was taking horseback riding lessons at the time because I thought I wanted to go to Mongolia and I wanted to be able to ride a pony, but I never got over my fear. But anyway, at that time, I thought, well, maybe we'll have a couple of horses. So I told my real estate agent I was looking for some land, and she said, well, how many acres? And I said, 100 is a nice round number. So we found this farm on Wellesley Island. It was a former dairy farm. It hadn't been operating as a dairy for about 50 or 60 years. First of all, I looked at the topo map in the real estate agent's office, and there was 80 feet of elevation because this is the St. Lawrence River Valley. There's not a lot of elevation in a lot of places. So I thought, ooh, I like this because it reminded me of I wanted some hills. I wanted some elevation because of my youth in the foothills of the Adirondacks. And so we come to the property and I see a rocky ridge on the right side of the road. And I run right up to the top of it. And it looked like the foothills of the Adirondacks. It had moss and lichens and pine trees. It was like I was my childhood home. So it turns out that the geological substrate of the Adirondacks continues under the St. Lawrence River all the way into Canada to the Algonquin Park. So it's really the same geology as my childhood memories. So I just fell in love with the land. And the house was another story. It was one of those money pits, an old farmhouse. But anyway, so that's how we came to the land. And we weren't planning to be farmers at first.
That's a lot of land for not planning to be farmers.
Well,
what was the vision? Room to breathe.
It was, it was reasonably priced. It was a nice big piece. I said I thought I might get a couple of horses. And, we like to cross country ski. So we could ski out our back door, hiking across the road where those rocky ridges were. It was nice to hike on our own property. So it was, my partner, Dave, needed a place to store a lot of industrial equipment because the place that he was renting was being raised to build a bank. And so we had a detached garage on the property that suited his needs. And I had land to roam around.
Where did you originally get the inspiration for a food forest, permaculture, ecological design?
That's a good question. So we had been operating an organic farm for 7 years. I was in charge of the annual vegetables. My partner took care of the animals. We have beef, cows, we have pigs, we have goats, we have chickens, ducks. And I always like to expand my knowledge of different aspects of agriculture. So the local cooperative extension office was offering a 2-hour class on permaculture. So I had never heard the term before, honestly. I had no idea what it was, but I went. And the ideas made so much sense to me, modeling a planting after a forest edge and integrating all of the natural ways to provide nutrients and pest control and disease control and all that. It just made so much sense that before the 2 hours were up, I decided I was going to plant an edible forest. And I came home, I told my partner that I needed a fence because we have a lot of deer pressure on the island and you can't have little seedlings and berry, anything. If you have deer pressure, you have to protect it. So he built me a nice sturdy fence around half an acre. And I thought I was going to plant right away. And then I started looking into it, reading books and, studying the subject a little more. And I realized I had a lot of planning to do before I could start to plant. So I decided I'd start. This was in March when I took the class. So I decided I'd delay planting till the following spring. And I just study my land and plan what I was going to do during that ensuing year.
What does that look like for you to study the land? A lot of people will call it different things, but.
Well, I was very lucky that the little plot that my partner decided to fence has all of these different microclimates. It has south-facing slope, a southwest-facing slope, a northeast-facing slope, a southeast-facing slope. It has 3 rivulets that flow in when there's snow melt or heavy rain above the ground. There was a part in the southeast corner. There was standing water all year. I studied it all year, by the way. There was standing water all the time. So I said, well, that's a perfect place for a pond. There's already water, and all these little rivulets are heading there. So we dug a pond. So I planted a pond there. And then, there were some areas where the water table was close to the surface and others that were high and dry. And there was a very strong prevailing southwest wind, which I noted, and a north wind occasionally. So I thought I might have to protect my plants from those at some point. There was some natural shade. There was a scrubby woods along the upper fence. So that cast a little natural shade for the end of the day. So I noted that. just all those different features. Let's see frost pockets. So there's one area where frost always hit first and left last. And then that southwest facing slope, when there was snow melt in the spring, it melted before any other part of the garden. I thought, that's interesting. I knew it was southwest, but it wasn't that steep a slope. Started digging around. There was a lot of rock there underground. So I thought, this is an interesting microclimate. If the soil is shallow, but it warms up much quicker than the other. So I kind of use that information to decide what might do best there, and et cetera.
What plan are you going off of? I mean, was your knowledge based upon this 2-hour permaculture course that
I read books.
Extension
I read
offered?
books, but I never took a formal. I don't consider myself to be a permaculturist. I never took any formal course in it. I have no certification. Between you and me, and you might want to edit this out, a lot of people who take those courses, it's all in their heads. They don't do anything. And I wanted to do something. So, kind of by the seat of my pants, I just said, okay, I'm just going to do it and I'll learn from my experience. And I still keep reading books. I visited a couple of permaculture sites. I visited a 5-acre permaculture orchard in southern Quebec. I actually went to England and visited Martin Crawford's permaculture garden at his institute. I went to Holyoke, Mass, and looked at their little 1/10 of an acre garden in the city. So, I did a little research, but I don't have any certifications.
Yeah. What about some of the books? I'm curious who some of those influences are.
Yeah, I'll let you know. So Sepp Holzer wrote a book about his permaculture farm, 140-hectare farm in the mountains of Austria. So that one I thought was very interesting. I like practical books. I like books that give me practical information. His had a lot of practical ideas, some of which I employed. Martin Crawford's books, the main book that he wrote that I relied on was one of my Bibles, is called Creating a Forest Garden. And that has huge amount of practical information about how to design your garden, but also about all the plants that you can incorporate. And then he wrote some other books that I've referred to also. Hemingway's Gaia's Garden. He had some helpful ideas. And then, the Bible, Jackie's tome, his 2-volume tome on temperate permaculture. The title is actually Edible Forest Gardens. But I especially like his appendix with all the information about specific plants and all the features of them, and then all the wildlife features and all that. So, Reich's book, Lee Reich's book on landscaping with fruit. He had a lot of unusual plants that he described there that I'd never heard of. So I liked, and he gave very detailed description. So that was very helpful. Like a Shapova, the Shapova tree. Do you know what that is?
I don't know.
It's a cross between a European mountain ash and a pear tree. And it needs a pear tree or a European mountain ash to fertilize it, for pollination. And it has petite little pears that have a unique flavor. By the way, I wasn't familiar. I'd never seen or heard of 95% of the plants I ended up planting. So besides studying, how to design this garden and integrate all those features, those natural features, I was studying all kinds of catalogs, plant nursery catalogs and books that talk about plants. And so if I saw a description of a plant that I thought I could grow, I bought it.
Yeah. Was it more based on just your interest, or was it based on native species to the area? What was the philosophy that you're going off of?
I just wanted a huge diversity. So I wasn't partial to natives, although I've incorporated many natives. And I know that some people want to use natives exclusively, and I respect that. But there's no native Asian pear. Apples aren't native. Come on, apples, pears, Asian pears, plums. Well, there are native plums. And I'm growing them, American plums. But there's so many delectable fruits and berries that aren't native. I had no reason to want to exclude that.
It sounds like you really wanted to go with a food forest rather than a very diverse polycultural system. What I see is people have a guiding vision, and it really informs the philosophy that they instill in how do they go about creating and transforming a piece of property that some people may really want that medicinal quality. Other people may really gravitate more towards an edible landscape, where others are just really interested in how do I revitalize this land and create healthy soil and bring bird life back, or beauty and pollinators.
Mine was already pretty wild. Wellesley is pretty protected. Wellesley Island is pretty wild. The interior is almost like wilderness. It's not a huge island. It's only nine miles long and maybe 5 miles wide, but there's very little development on the interior. It's mostly the waterfront that's developed. And it's also a bird pathway from the US to Canada, a migration route for birds. And we have a great diversity of wildlife here because of its proximity to Canada and the US and the river. So it's a very diverse area. But I want to answer your question because since we had an operating farm, I wanted my garden to provide an income stream to the farm. So I actually designed it as an event thing, in addition to having all of those wonderful, and beautiful plants. And I also was very focused on aesthetics, on the landscaping aesthetics, and also on the aesthetics of individual plants. Now, again, I have no formal training in any of this. Although I did have a landscape architect, a woman. She didn't tell me that she was a landscape architect when she came and I showed her around. I gave her a tour. This was in the early years of the garden. It's in its 10th year now. And at the end, she told me she was a landscape architect. And I said, well, how would you grade my garden? And she said, 4.0. So, I mean, I'm not an architect, but you know what? I see it as a sculpture in 4 dimensions. It's a sculpture. And I always loved to work in clay and do sculpture when I was younger. I didn't have time for it as an older person. But so the 4 dimensions, of course, are height, length, width, and time. So, planning the garden was such an exciting challenge for me. It was like solving an equation, like linear algebra, which I flunked in college because I didn't understand its application. But it's like solving a problem with like multiple variables. Because you have to think about so many different things when you make a decision about where to place a plant, for example. You've got to think about its ideal habitat, what's surrounding it, how distant it has to be, how much sun does it need, what kind of air circulation is beneficial. Does it need an extended growing season, or should we keep it dormant longer so it won't flower prematurely and have those flowers zapped by a frost? So all of these things, and then for each plant, and then combining them. I mean, it was so exciting. I was just so stimulated by that intellectual task.
I'm glad to hear that it was stimulating for you, because I think that it can be overwhelming for a lot of folks as well.
Well, I know, and that's why sometimes people don't even get started, because it just seems like impossible. But I'm old enough that my ego has been shaved over the years. I used to have a really bad super ego, but now I can control it. So, I mean, I'm not judging myself. I just want to learn from doing. In fact, my book is full of owning all kinds of mistakes I made as I developed this garden. And when I write my second edition, I'm sure there'll be more to include. But anyway, so I just jumped in. I did the planning, and then I ordered all the overstory trees for the half acre, almost all of them, late that winter and early spring. And they all arrived, and I planted them according to my plan. I had to scale drawing of the garden, and I found out that the best way to do the planning of where all the plants were going to go was to cut out circles on graph paper that represented their mature diameter, their mature canopies, and then kind of move them around and see how they fit together without, and spacing them properly. So, yeah, I planted all my overstory. I actually planned my bushes, my shrubs, but I was worried about that fruit fly that drills holes in immature fruit and lays its eggs. And then, when the fruit matures, they're either crawling out of it, or you take a bite, and you took a bite of one of the larvae. So anyway, I was worried about that. And I thought, the powers that be would figure out how to manage it if I waited. So that's why I didn't plant my berry bushes right away, because some of them fruit the first year or even the second year. So I waited till the second year to plant my berry bushes that I'd already planned. And then the ground cover kind of came later. So that's the way I did it. And and the way we prepared the ground, since we had animals, it was kind of scrubby brush and some trees. And first we put the goats and the cows in to eat some of the ground cover and the leaves on the trees. And then we put the pigs in all winter long, and they ate all the perennial weeds and tilled up the garden a little bit, tilled up the land. So it was pretty bare. And then that spring, I frost seeded a bunch of clovers because I have heavy clay. So I knew I had to do some remediation to break up the pan and help improve drainage and also aerate it. But I didn't have time. I was 63. I didn't have time to wait 5 years to get my land ready. So I just threw a bunch of clover in the ground and I started to plant that spring. I wanted to really make it an elegant garden. So I included a huge limestone patio, 30 feet in diameter. And on top of the hill, so I didn't plant all this at once, but I have a bandstand that's a semicircle, 20 feet wide. And it's wired for sound, by the way. We've had parties there with the band. And I have this limestone stone road heading, the whole length of the garden is 200 feet, heading in toward this big round gathering area and then out the other gate. So that's a 10-foot wide limestone road. A lot of machine work. I have other patios. I have 2 ponds and a bridge between them with a trellis. I mean, I've got all this little, just to make it a beautiful place. And, people who come in there, I've heard this of other edible forests or food forests, even if they're not that elaborate in infrastructure. But people spontaneously refer to my garden as magical. It just has this ambiance that just transports you to another place. Okay, ready for another question.
What are some of those mistakes that you would do differently?
Dealing with perennial quackgrass. I have a lot of perennial quackgrass in my my walkways and so on, and it is infiltrated into some of my beds. And I'm needing to re-sheet mulch my beds. And there's no guarantee that one application of sheet mulch is going to get rid of it either. To get rid of it. And I actually just bought a new book written by somebody from New Zealand who talks about planting barriers of plants to keep the quackgrass out. And the ones she suggests are Egyptian onions, Egyptian walking onions, daylilies, chives, and a couple of others. She says the barrier has to be 2 feet deep, and you also have to plant your plants really close. So my intention next year, when the sheet mulch has done its job somewhat, I'm gonna plant like daylilies as a border to one of the beds that's really a problem, and another bed that's not a problem yet, but would be if I didn't do anything. I'm going to experiment with the Egyptian onions, and then I will know what works and what doesn't, so I can tell people in my second edition. So that's one of the mistakes. The mistake was not to anticipate that quackgrass was going to be a problem and build in something ahead of time to keep it from moving into some of my beds. It hasn't moved into all of them, but those it's infested, it's really a problem. So that's one mistake. Oh, well, I mean, a mistake I made that if I'd been a landscape architect or an engineer, I probably wouldn't have made. I dug 2 ponds on a downhill slope, and the top pond drained into the bottom pond. Not completely, but halfway. And I didn't want the level to be where it was. So I actually had a landscape architect intern helping me that summer, and he suggested a weir. So we had a metal weir fabricated by a foundry, and we inserted it, and it held the water higher for a while until muskrats burrowed under it. My ponds were such a wonderful habitat. A family of muskrats moved in, and before I knew it, they burrowed under it and drained the pond. So I tried to shore it up any way I could. We used chain link fence. I spent so many thousands of dollars trying to shore it up, on this material that's supposed to seal the pond. It didn't work. Anyway, and then finally I had to line it, which I didn't want to do because it's supposed to be a natural thing. But my mistake was to dig 2 ponds on a slope, but I didn't know. So anyway, that was very costly.
It sounds like you've had a lot of help there, Dani. How has that come together for you between hired consultants versus interns?
I didn't hire any
Okay.
consultants. I hired a backhoe operator to make my road and dig my ponds and do some moving some soil around. And then when he went out of business, I hired a skid steer operator, another kind of heavy equipment person to finish the road and lay some patios and stuff like that. So it was basically contracted labor, not consultants. And then we've always, part of our mission as a farm is to provide education to as many people as possible about how to grow healthy organic food. So we've always welcomed volunteers, interns, woofers on the farm. We have housing available. So especially during the first few years, I was very active in sending my internship announcements to neighboring colleges. We had some wonderful interns like from SUNY ESF, which is an environmental college nearby in Syracuse, and that's where the landscape architect, I had two actually over time, came from. And then from Clarkson, where all these engineering students, they were great. So I had wonderful crews from both of those places, over the years, and also woofers and other volunteers, local volunteers. Right. We just had two volunteers live in for 2 weeks and now they're gone. So now I have nobody, for a stretch of time. And then we might get, I think the daughter of a friend of mine is going to come in mid-July for a couple of weeks. So, yeah.
And what kind of housing do you provide for them?
We have two rooms upstairs in the house, 2 bedrooms. We can sleep 4 here, 2 in each room. And sometimes people have just chosen to tent. Like we had one fellow who was a senior in college, and he was an English major, and he lived close by. So he came during the week, he tented, and he was writing a journal like for his senior thesis in college about his experience at the farm. So he worked, and we have them work 6 days a week for a few hours, and we feed them. And then we're on this wonderful island. The river's right there. There's hiking trails. There's swimming. I have boats I lend. I have bikes I lend. And it's a summer resort area. So there's lots of cultural stuff going on in the summer. So if somebody works like from 8 to 3 with an hour for lunch, they have the whole afternoon and evening off, and the sun doesn't set till 9 o'clock. So there's a lot of time, a lot of free time to just enjoy. And we've gotten so many wonderful projects done with some of these crews. It's just been such a benefit to us, and they've had a wonderful experience. Many of them have come back.
So you plan out your projects ahead of time and they are able to pick it up?
Well, we had an experience years ago where a couple was supposed to come and stay 2.5 months, and they left after a few days. And that's when Dave and I decided we are not going to plan on anything for our volunteer help because you can't count on them to be reliable. So we decided that whatever we take on, we're going to be able to manage by ourselves. And if we do have extra help, that's when we can do the extra things. So yes, if we have a project, like let's say rebuilding a hoop house, which has yet to be done, but I'm getting a crew from a college. I'm getting a whole crew from freshman week, like for 4 or 5 days in August from a college. And I think that's going to be the crew that's going to rebuild my hoop house. But anyway, Dave is so savvy with all the trades. So he would train them. He would train and supervise them in a project like that. I mean,
what is the ideal length of stay for them?
Oh, it doesn't matter. I mean, we prefer somebody to stay for, I'd say for me, 2 weeks, because by then they have mastered some things that they can do independently. But we'll take people for a week. We have some local volunteers who come for a few hours in 1 day a week, and that, over time. We've had people stay for 3 months. I think that's about the longest we've had people stay, and all year round too, because we have animals. And plus there's maintenance chores to do all year in terms of the plants as well. And I start growing things in the house. Well, sometimes I start growing things like woody herbs in December. And then I start probably around the 1st of February, I start planting my vegetable sets. So, there's things to do.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And to learn all year round.
Dani, how has the food forest and the forest garden philosophy impacted the animal operations that you have or the rest of the farm? Right.
Well, the animals help to prepare the land. when we haven't had adequate fencing around the outside of the fence, they've grazed on my vines that are growing on the fence, the goats. They stuck their noses in and ate some of my strawberries that I planted initially in that area. I've never actually had a break-in of cows or goats into the garden. Thank goodness. They get to eat stuff. So let's say I prune raspberries. I give the goats the raspberry canes. They love that. Let's say I prune fruit, any kind of berry bushes. They get the trimmings. So, nothing goes to waste on the farm. So they get some of the things that I might want to remove. And we do management intensive rotational grazing.
Yeah.
That's the way we manage our animals. So they're on a small plot for a day, and then they move to the next plot and they move around. So we're improving the pasture constantly through, just like the bison did in the middle of the US before the white man, messed with it. So yeah, we're improving the pasture. That's my partner Dave's primary objective is to improve the soil. Then the pasture, and then the animals. That's the order in which he prioritizes his decisions. So yeah, we're regenerative super in that area. And the edible forest itself, I mean, the ground is never disturbed once I plant it. And, I add a lot of mulch, when I need to, but more and more, the plants are providing the mulch themselves, just like in a forest. Everything's recycled. And I invite all kinds of wildlife in. I have bird houses. In fact, I love this. So this year I had a caterpillar nest on a branch of one of my plums. And I did what Stefan up in Miracle Farm says, don't do anything. And 3 days later, it was pilfered with holes. The birds had eaten all the caterpillars they could reach. And then about a week or two later, I see half-inch long caterpillars crawling on the outside of the nest. The nest hadn't gotten any bigger. A few days later, there were none, and there were holes in the nest again. Then I saw bigger caterpillars, the ones that I guess they didn't get, were crawling on top of the nest. And a few days later, the nest was completely decimated. There were no caterpillars and no nest. That's
birds.
The way you want it to work, right? So I was just thrilled with that. And, normally people see a nest, they destroy it. But my philosophy now is, no, the birds need something to eat. If they don't have something to eat, they're not going to be around. So I don't clearly, if I have a seedling, like I had one instance last year, I have this Michigan pecan and it wasn't doing great. And I noticed that caterpillars were eating all the growing tips. And I needed to do something because I needed to save the tree. So I took some insecticidal soap and I sprayed it. And this year it looks fabulous. So that's the extent of my spraying. I don't like to spray. I don't enjoy it. I have no interest in spraying. So I have some pest issues that I've yet to address because I'm not spraying like Surround or BT or anything like that. The one thing I tried to spray was poison ivy. So I got this concentrated, I have a few little patches of poison ivy in the garden. That's not good for people coming to UPIC, right? And I've had 4 cases of poison ivy already this year because I'm so allergic. So I got this concentrated vinegar, which was supposed to kill stuff like that. It's organically approved. It's not like Roundup or anything. And I sprayed the poison ivy a few times and I found that it just grew away from where I sprayed. So it actually expanded. So I said, this is not working. I'm not going to do this anymore. So now I'm trying to sheet mulch it out. So we'll see how that works.
How does your day stack up, maybe compared with annual vegetables?
Oh, well, annual vegetables. Oh, I was so tired of doing them. I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to reduce that for years, but that's what supports the farm. So finally, with the book, I have an excuse. So I cut back by 3/4 this year on my annual vegetables because I have to have time to do what I'm doing right now and to go places and give presentations and market the book and all that. So thank goodness. Annual vegetables. When I was doing 3/4 acre, I worked from dawn till dusk every single day. I have an acre edible forest, And if I have to spend 3 hours in there every second or third day, that's about it. Huge difference, except for the harvest. Now, the only task other than making up for mistakes like letting quackgrass enter, and having to shingles, the only task that's really growing in labor time is the harvesting. I mean, the abundance, my berries. So I'm going to gear up marketing for you pickers, because if they pick, then I don't have to. It's actually more cost effective for them to pick and pay me half of what I could charge for a pint than for me to pick. So anyway, the labor that's grown is the harvesting time. But is that a bad thing? And you know what I've come to this year? This year, because, I'm just saying, well, I had to sacrifice a huge bed. I couldn't weed whack it or pretty it up. So I had like 20 honeyberry plants in there. And I just said, let the birds have it. So now I'm noticing some of my currants are really small this year. I don't know why, but they're small. The berries are small. And I just decided today, I'm just going to let the birds have them. That cuts down on my harvesting labor. So, I've just come to be so much more accepting of natural forces since I'm doing this garden. And it's so relaxing.
What made you decide to write the home scale forest garden?
Okay, so this goes back to my history. So I was in a PhD program for clinical psych when I was a young person, and I never wrote the book. I never did the dissertation. I didn't have the social skills. I didn't have the planning skills. My super ego was so overwhelming. I couldn't even, like you were saying before, I couldn't even get started because it seemed like such an overwhelming task. And so I never did it. So I left with a conciliatory master's of clinical psych. Okay. It wasn't a regret, but it was something that was undone in my life, writing a book. And so a friend of mine, around the 7th year, a friend of mine suggested I write a book. And I'd already been thinking about it, write a book about the garden. And she was a professor of special ed, and she had already written a couple of books. So she said to me, I thought she said, Dani, I want to write a book about your garden. I said, great, I would love to have a book about my garden. Go ahead and write it. No, that's not what she meant. She meant I was going to write the book, and she was going to kind of oversee it. Well, I didn't want to do a book until the 10th year because I'm not a permaculturist. I don't have any credentials. I felt like I had to have 10 years under my belt of experience in order to actually pretend I was some kind of authority and write a book. So anyway, I'm giving a presentation at a NOFA convention in Syracuse right before COVID. It was January of the year that COVID happened. And a senior editor from Chelsea Green approached me after my presentation, and she invited me to submit a proposal. And this was in January, and I thought about it for quite a while. I knew I couldn't do it during the growing season because I was so, from dawn to dusk with the annual vegetables. So, but I finally decided I can't pass up this opportunity, Chelsea Green. So I wrote the proposal in September. It involved 2 full chapters, a bibliography, a marketing plan, an expanded table of contents, which was like 7.5 pages long, which was basically the outline for the entire book. So I submitted that, and they accepted it. So, I had decided to write the book. I mean, and I was pretty confident that it would be accepted because, first of all, I was approached. I wasn't submitting something cold. And I asked her what the odds were of something being accepted. So she said that company receives about 200 proposals a year and they accept 30. Well, I thought those odds were great because when I applied to graduate school, I was one of 13 accepted out of 500. So I thought, yeah, those are great odds. So, and I was, I mean, it's a topic that more and more people are interested in. My writing is very easy to, it's very conversational. I don't use any jargon. I don't even use the word guild. Plant groupings. Okay. So there's nothing to put anybody off. And, I have all these little anecdotes about my experiences some of them are very amusing, like how I cooked my gooseberries, and that wasn't in a pot; it was in the field. Um, so it's and the pictures are beautiful, and the way they laid out the book. I mean, they did just a phenomenal job laying out the book. So I wrote the book. Actually, I had 2 chapters done. I wrote it in 2.5 months.
Wow. Did they pay you to write the book?
I didn't accept an advance because I didn't want to have to owe them that money from the royalties. That's the way it works. Mm-hmm. So I didn't accept an advance. I didn't need one. I mean, I've got Social Security. I've got a pension. I'm independently wealthy. So no, but I'll tell you. You want to know how I disciplined myself to write it? Okay, please. So I got up at 4 a.m. I meditate and I do some weightlifting and take a walk, whatever. So about 5:30, I sat down and started writing. And I knew I had to do a chapter a week to get it done in 2.5 months. So I had to do 1,800 words a day. So my goal was 1,800 words. I worked 6 or 7 hours. When I got my 1,800 words, I quit for the day. It's only noon, so I had the rest of the day. And then 5:30, it's like 6.5 hours, right? 5:30 to noon. And then if I finished a chapter before 7 days, I gave myself a day off. But if I didn't, I didn't. And so I had it done in 2.5 months, a chapter a week. I had 10 chapters to write. And then the contract I negotiated only gave me 4 months to do the book. So then I had a month and a half to refine to put the manuscript into the right format, to do all what they call the back matter, the appendix and the glossary and the bibliography and all that stuff and the charts. And, I had help. I did have a woofer living in at the time who knew how to do word processing much better than I did. So she kind of formatted the book for me. And I also had a lot of people read it while I was writing it and give me feedback, like my sister and a couple of friends and a guy who runs a research farm for the Cooperative Extension Cornell in New York State. He looked it over for scientific validity. And also this was great. That fall, I had a woofer who was taking a year off. This was in the first year of COVID in the fall. She was an urban studies major at MIT. She was taking a semester off because of COVID. She didn't want to learn remotely. And she was an English minor. And so she pre-edited my manuscript before I sent it in to the publisher. So I had a lot of wonderful help, and I've given them all credit in my acknowledgments in the book. And I had this amazing crew that fall. They were all Ivy Leaguers, and they all didn't want to pay that tuition and learn remotely. I had one from Columbia, and she did my sketches for the book. I had an architect major from Cornell. He did my CAD drawings. I had this woman who did my pre-editing from MIT. And then I had a guy from Princeton who was very savvy technically, and he helped me deal with all my issues with the computer. So I had this, and they stayed for 2 to 3 months, all of them. And it was just fabulous. So in fact, they've all visited since. And actually my sketch artist is coming back this July. She's going to visit. And my editor has visited twice. She just graduated from MIT, and she lives on the West Coast like you. She lives in Berkeley. And before she went back home, she and her brother came here for a weekend, for Memorial Day weekend, just for old time's sake. I'm going to cry. And then she flew home. So yeah, I've had wonderful. I keep touch with some of the volunteers one of them is my best friend today. She was a local woman whose husband was a soldier. She had 3 preschoolers, and she needed a respite. So she put them in daycare for 4 hours, 1 day a week. She had a black thumb when she came to me, and she kind of apprenticed herself to me in gardening skills. And that was over 1.5 years through winter and then another summer season. Then she had to move to Georgia, and she landscaped she had bought a brand new house and landscaped her lot in edibles. And when it came time to sell it, because they moved again, in the Army, it sold before other houses that were newer in the same development because of that edible landscaping. And we're still friends. So, yeah. It's been wonderful. Fantastic. I've met wonderful people and just have had a joyful experience developing and just spending time in that garden. I get lost in there frequently, just wandering around like Dani, the other day. Well, go ahead.
With your background in the correctional system, do Do you see any promise of getting hands in the soil as a alternative path to a correctional facility?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we have a program. We have an Army base. This is a little off the subject, but it's similar. We have an Army base in our county, and there's a transitional program for soldiers, leaving the service. And part of it is apprenticeships at local farms. Because for soldiers who are used to being outdoors and doing manual labor, for many of them, it's a perfect transition to something productive in civilian life.
That's hopeful.
So that's very hopeful. As far as, yes, I definitely think anybody with mental health issues, anybody with problems adjusting to society, I think it's a spiritually refreshing way to spend your time. Wouldn't you say?
Well, Dani, I would certainly agree, and am very impressed at your ability to leverage resources and people and the land and create just this incredible field of energy, it seems, that you have around you.
Oh, thank you.
And really look forward to hearing other people's response to the Home Scale Forest Garden book. Where can people go to learn more about you, or to visit the farm and be a woofer or anything like that?
Well, I have a website, enchantededibleforest.com. And there are some videos of me now posted there. And I started a blog, which is mostly pictures. It's mostly like Instagram, which I know nothing about, but it's like pictures with little descriptions. Like I took a walk around my garden on New Year's Eve, and one of my pictures is of fox tracks in the snow. And I talk about how beneficial foxes are because they eat rodents, and I'm happy to see those tracks. So I have a blog, and this podcast will be posted there along with all the other podcasts and radio interviews I've done. All the events where I'm going to be speaking offsite are posted. But anyone who wants to come up here, I'm up in the boonies, northern New York State. It's like 6 hours from New York City, just so your listeners understand. I'm happy to arrange tours for small groups, large groups, workshops, and you pick. So, if people are local or they're coming up here for vacation and they want to have an experience picking their own fruits or herbs or edible flowers or even a bouquet, that's available by appointment as well. And all that information is on my website. Well,
Dani, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for putting just this work out into the world. I think it's tremendous and such a great example for people to be able to pick up and follow.
Thank you. I hope, Neil, if you ever come east, you could come visit my garden.
We'll try to make it up there. But thank you for just spending an hour with me.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.